Hand-roasted politics, no sugar. International politics, just as you like. To the point. Without filter and no extras. And hopefully, well-tempered. And now, please welcome your host for today.
Hello everyone in here, out there, to a new episode of Hand-Roasted Politics. My name is Constantin Grund. We are coming back to the recent and ongoing conflict in Sudan, which, as you know, broke out in April 2023 between the RSF and the SAF. As you also know, huge parts of the country are taken hostage at this point. Today, we are focusing specifically on the situation of women in this war. How do they see the root causes of the conflict? How do they experience the fighting on a day-to-day level? And above all, is there any role to play for them in the possible solution finding? I have the pleasure today to talk to Hala Al-Karib. Hello. Welcome to Studio Fritz.
Thank you very much.
You are Regional Director of the SIHA Network, which translates to Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa. So you bring together an extensive network of hundreds of grassroots organizations from various countries in the region, which makes you exactly the person to talk to today. So tell me, many women in Sudan live in an apocalyptic war zone. What can you tell us about the suffering of women in the current fighting?
I would say that, this war particularly is centralized around exploiting women's bodies and using women's bodies as war strategy and as war tools. And it's quite painful, and I think until now, so many of us, they cannot imagine the level of the suffering that women have been encountered since the beginning of the war. But of course, this did not happen in a vacuum. The suffering and the struggle of Sudanese women, it's something that has been happening for more than 30 years. We are, coming out of a very brutal regime that dedicated its policies and laws to the humiliation and subordination of women, which is Al-Bashir regime. And unfortunately, despite the fact that throughout the transition, as women activists and women leaders, we invested significant effort trying to influence the transitional government to disconnect, laws and policies from Bashir era and to show commitments to women's human rights. But typically, we have been ignored. It's a syndrome in Sudanese politics, the suppression of women. And I think, the silence about the violation that has been happening in Darfur, since 2003, the sexual violence against women and girls, and the fact that central Sudan politicians and elites, they were very silent, and political elites, they were very silent about that, despite the fact that the International Criminal Court has indicted al-Bashir of sexual violence, being in command, of the operation in Darfur. But still, that issue did not quite resonate, or understood and acknowledged, by our political elites. And I think for that particular reason, the RSF, aka Janjaweed militia, they have been emboldened, and enabled, because elements of accountability when it comes to sexual violence in conflicts, when it comes to the brutalities that was committed against civilians, was completely neglected, throughout the transition, despite the fact that, none of us would forget what happened in central Khartoum on June 3rd, the atrocity of the disbursement of Khartoum sitting. And I remember, civil society and Sudan Doctors Committee, they documented more than 70 cases of sexual violence. Some of them are men and boys. And the RSF were a critical part of that atrocity. So for all this reason, sexual violence has been the core characteristic, I would say, and I'm not exaggerating, of this conflict. Yeah.
Do women who are victim of sexual violence get any help in terms of prevention or in terms of trauma management at the moment?
This is what breaks my heart. I would say, myself, my colleagues, we have been living in a nightmare since April 15. It has been horrific because at April 15, midday, this is when the calls started, and it didn't stop until now. And in my view, that what exacerbated, the violence and the conflict, and this is also what is complicating the whole process of peace and peace talks. And so, unfortunately, we're talking about conflict-related sexual violence in societies that are closed societies, there is a lot of prohibitions and a lot of, fear and a lot of shame around women's bodies, So it's really difficult for the survivor to speak up about what's happening to them. You're not going to believe that as much as we are dealing with cases that is now happening, in Al Jazeera, in Kordofan, in South Kordofan, there is areas that people, they don't know about. They don't know, for example, the South Kordofan, the prevalence of sexual violence is unbelievable. Al Jazeera, women are reaching the point of killing themselves out of pain and shame. The preventions, the only possible prevention is to flee. Because what can you do, against a gun? A lot of the, male-headed households, they lost their lives in Khartoum, in Darfur, in Kordofan, while they were defending their daughters and their sisters. Women were raped in front of their family members. It happened in El Junaina, it happened in Al Jazeera, it happened in many parts of Sudan. And it's a tool for humiliation. It's a tool to break communities. And the truth of the matter, that the wide scale of displacement, it's primarily happening because people are afraid of rape and sexual violence. I've written an article in the New Humanitarian, early days of the war, when I was still in Sudan, and I said it clearly that the only reason, that I was very insistent, just 5 days to the war, to leave our home in Khartoum, because I had my daughter, my nieces, they are there. And I know the RSF, I know the Janjaweed very well. I've worked in Darfur for more than 20 years. And I know that sexual violence is inevitable, and we just had to back and leave somewhere to Jazeera before it was invaded, So it's the main reason for forced displacement. Now, response to the survivor, this is the most painful part. The allocation of resources, for access to sexual and reproductive health is minimal until now. The availability of the protocols that follows the cases of sexual violence is not as, compared to the scale of violence. The investment on the awareness of the communities. I remember a case, she was raped, in south of Khartoum. And we managed to get hold of her, coincidentally, through someone from our network. She went to Al-Managil in Al Jazeera, and we we were in touch with her and with her husband, and they kept saying, oh, she's fine, she's okay. And she kept saying, I'm okay, I'm fine. I went to the midwife, I'm fine. God knows, if the midwife, we don't know. We fear that women are remutilating themselves, But people, they are not aware of, of the STDs. They are not aware of sexual transmitted diseases. I have spoken to a physician who served in south of Khartoum, for over a year in one of the hospitals, and she was collaborating with the MSF, and she told me that 60% of the female patients I see, they have syphilis, they have other forms of STDs. So there is no investment. This is a community that was not exposed, to conversations about sexual violence, so even to convince the victims to go and see a physician, it's a lot of hard work. The level of investment and response is miserable and sad, and it breaks my heart, and it's just as if we don't worth anything. Our suffering doesn't worth anything, which is I don't understand. And we have been talking about this for a very long time. Sudan until now does not have a one-stop center. And people who work on humanitarian aid, they understand that. A one-stop center is a small clinic. It could be a tent, but it's private, it's safe. A woman can come in and receive all the services they need. There is so many cases that require surgical interventions because majority of the cases of sexual violence happening in Sudan are gang rape cases, which speaks to how systematic, and it's part of the war strategy. It is.
Tell me, some would argue that the war in Sudan is an affair amongst men. Why is it that the violence is turning against women?
Because historically, women's bodies are used as tools, in Sudanese politics, in Sudanese wars, it's tools. And they have not been any heritage of accountability. In institutions like ours, civil society, when we started talking about sexual violence, we were slandered, We were slandered by coalitions and groups and civil society whom we assumed, they were with us on the same side when it comes to civilian protection. Until now, many claimed, women organizations, they claim that they are working on behalf of women. When it comes to sexual, they are okay speaking about women political participation. It's okay to speak about access to food. But when it comes to sexual violence, no. Maybe SIHA can speak about that. We are not into this. So they are trying to show as if sexual violence is not real, as if it didn't happen and it doesn't happen, and as if, the pain of the women, the pain of the communities is not real. And as I said, in my view, this is what's going to make peace difficult. This is always what has been making peace difficult in Sudan, those underlying issues that never made it to the negotiating tables.
Is there any way to say if there are groups of women who are more vulnerable than others?
Yes, they are. Poor women are more vulnerable than others. All of us who have means, we left. If you can't leave, then you are susceptible. As Sudanese, we're not all rich. I still have family members who are living in RSF-controlled areas. I don't know what they are experiencing. I try, But I remember I have an aunt, and I really wanted to say that sexual violence is not the only, crime that was committed against women. Torture, forced labor, literally enslavement. Women, they experience that. My aunt is 80 years old. She is in Jazeera state. She would walk from her home and she will ban her daughter and her daughter-in-law to leave the house to try to go and get some food. And she would be harassed by RSF soldiers, They will put gun into her head and they will say, why are you still alive? And you are too old. They will mock her. They will snatch her, her top and all those things. I have spoken to a group of grandmothers that I used to work with them in south of Omdurman. And they told me that the RSF, they would tell them that you are too ugly to be raped, but you have to serve us. And those women, all of them, grandmothers groups, they were working, in neighborhood watch and things like that. They were made to wash the RSF soldiers' clothes, and they were made to cook for RSF, and then after that, they were forced to dance. Women above 70 and 75 forced to dance to teenage kids, traumatized RSF kids who would laugh at them, and then they will shoot guns on their head and laugh at them running away, So it's the level of humiliations and dehumanization that's happening to women in Sudan and not being spoken about. But we are insisting that we will not be silent. Not too many of us, we're not too many, but we are pushing, for this narrative to be known because it's really important.
Many women manage to flee outside the country. Is there any way for you to tell if their life actually improved being in a refugee camp in Chad, for example?
No. I mean, we work with, some of with the Women's Center. We supported the establishment of a Women's Center in Adri. And relatively safe, but there is lots of fear, particularly in Chad. Perpetrators are still around. But at least there is some space for healing. But their life is not good. There is a lot of survivors, for example, who managed to flee to Egypt. Some has fled to... there is a lot of survivors that nobody knows about. Right now we are dealing with cases that happened, for example, in May 2023. With sexual violence, it takes very long time, sometimes for the survivors to speak. And horrific stories are still coming up, so some they don't talk for a while and then they decide to talk, And of course there is a whole issue of women who are, especially recently in the past few months, who fled and they went through unwanted pregnancy and they left children behind them, especially those who were held captured by the RSF. We have a few situations where the victims, they would say, I fled, but I left a child. And nobody knows. So you can imagine the level of trauma. Yeah, and that they are going through. I just meant to answer, your previous questions. Women street vendors, who had to work despite everything because they don't have any other options. Being in Jazeera or in south of Khartoum or, even in relatively safe locations, under the self-control areas, they are quite exposed to high prevalence of sexual violence. And it happens on daily basis to them.
How do you perceive the international media coverage on these issues? When I'm listening to you, these are horrific stories. Is there enough reporting from those who are actually on the ground, Al Jazeera, the Deutsche Welle, and others?
No, there isn't. People are so obsessed with, the political rhetoric, which is recycling the same old conversations. They don't want to see that this conflict has one of the most horrific sides that we need to pay attention to. That regardless if it's going to stop today, how are we going to deal with this if we are not going to confront it? So no, the media coverage is extremely poor, absolutely, yeah.
If you look 5 years into the future, what is your idea of the situation in Sudan? Will we see some kind of ending of the fighting? Will there be a regime of transitional justice somewhere where those who are perpetrators are held accountable or not?
I have to say, I have to be hopeful. Otherwise, I will never continue to do what I'm doing. And this is also our answer to the survivors and to the victims, wherever they want to identify themselves. That, when they ask us, well, why don't you just give us a service? Why do you want to document what happened to us? Why do you want to know the story? Because we ask them, you can document it any way you want it. You want to share a voice note, write, but we want to know what happens to you, and we want to try to document it. And they kept saying, well, we know that we will never see our day in court, that there will not be justice. And we tell them, we should all agree that there must be justice, regardless of if it's going to happen or not. There must be justice. Otherwise, what can we do? We continue killing each other?
Let's talk about the international community, the famous international community in this for this case. It seems to be that this crisis is intentionally neglected.
Yeah, this is the most neglected crisis, I think, in the world. I think it's at the beginning it has been disregarded and undermined, but right now it's exacerbated, and everyone seems to be very conflicted and confused about it. This is a very complex crisis. I mean, the most complex parts about it, it's a proxy war. So there is actors who are funding and supporting the sustainability of this war. And I think unless we were able to speak about that, and develop strategies in terms of how should we address those actors and what they want, and have an open conversations, have a conversations or, with them in terms of how can they stop, funding this campaign of atrocities. I think it's going to continue. We cannot keep moving around, the core issue without going straight towards addressing it. I strongly believe that at some point we should have, civilian protections mechanisms on the ground. It's needed. But it's really critical alongside that to address, the root causes of this war and its continuity. Sudan is poor, it's corrupt, it's weak government, but this violence, it shouldn't have happened despite all these factors.
Isn't there any way for the international community to better protect the life of civilians in Sudan right now?
I think the only way to protect the life of civilians in Sudan is to, as I said, parallelly work on constructing a civilian protections plans, but at the same time, a clear conversations with the suppliers of arms and weapons and those who are interested in sustaining this war. And most importantly, I think it's critical to start the accountability, and to hold those who are commanding these atrocities accountable. Because the only reason that it's going on, because they are not used to be held accountable. The RSF is being glorified for committing atrocities. SAF, with the exceptions of the indictment of al-Bashir and his aide in the Darfur. And it worked. I believe it worked. It was very slow, but it worked. The only reason that al-Bashir, and his inner circle, has fallen apart is the fact that they have turned into a liability, even for their own political organizations. And it's really important to hold the RSF leadership accountable and for them, to understand and see that there is a price to pay, and for other potential warlords as well to see that this cannot continue to happen.
If you had a breakfast meeting with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, what would you ask him to do? Because the UN system seems to be paralyzed vis-à-vis this crisis also.
I think what the UN can do is they can significantly improve their humanitarian response to the current crisis. I know there is a lot of challenges of insecurity, but also there is ways where we could improve the humanitarian response as much as we can. Right now, we have hundreds of thousands of people who fled Al Jazeera. Those people are staying in the middle of nowhere with no access to food, with no access to shelter. I worked in humanitarian crisis setups. I worked in Darfur, I worked in South Sudan, and I am so sad about how the sector is being deteriorated in terms of capacity to respond to the crisis. The current resources, I'll tell the Secretary General that the current resources allocated to the crisis in Sudan does not anywhere match the scale of the crisis. We need much more resources. We need much more capacity. The reliant on local communities, such as emergency response and local grassroots civil society, is not enough. None of us has the capacity to respond to this huge crisis on our own. We need institution that has technical capacity and has the ability to respond. That would be my first, agenda item if I would have this conversation. Secondly, I will ask Mr. Guterres to assign, a core group of women activists as advisors to him, and to reflect and to tell him what's actually happening on the ground. Because our engagements, many of us as women who are working on the ground, we understand the brutality of Sudan armed forces. We have seen it, we lived through it, we fought it, and we know the Janjaweed and the RSF. Our positions are pro-Sudanese civilians, are pro-women, and are fundamentally moral position and pro-inclusivity and the voices of Sudanese people to be heard in this crisis.
Thank you very much, Hala Al-Karib, for sharing these stories with us today. Is there any way out of this mess?
There is a way out of this mess, absolutely. If we go back to the international law, to the same rules that the international system has constructed post the Second World War, and invited all of us to be part of it. And we believe that, and we bought into that, and we strongly think that we need to have a place within that structure. There is a way, absolutely.
Thank you very much for that positive note, however, at the end.
Thank you
very much. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you very soon again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Thanks a lot.
Hand-Roasted Politics, No Sugar is a Studio Fritz production for the German Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung.